The night Heath Ledger died, Manhattan was quiet in the particular way. Winter makes it quiet, like the city is holding its breath. In a rented apartment in Soho, the lights were low, the air was still, and one of the most watched men in Hollywood was completely alone. To the world, he was the actor who had just finished a performance so unsettling and brilliant it would soon swallow every headline. But in his final hours, there was no red carpet, no set, no soundtrack, only an exhausted body, a locked door, and a handful of prescriptions meant to calm a mind that refused to power down. How does a man reach the top of the industry and still end up dying in silence? Why were so many medications in the same room, prescribed across a fractured system, without anyone stopping to ask what happens when they meet inside one bloodstream? Why did the story quickly become a myth about a role driving him mad, when the real danger may have been far more ordinary, more preventable, and more terrifying? Insomnia, anxiety, and chemistry that no one treated like a ticking clock. And in the hours before he was found, what exactly happened behind that door? Who spoke to him last? What warnings were missed? And why, even after the official conclusion, did the final hours of Heath Ledger still feel like a case with empty spaces where answers should be? When news broke on the morning of January 22, 2008, it moved faster than the truth ever could. Within minutes, police tape outside a quiet Manhattan building became a global image. Reporters clustered on sidewalks. Television anchors struggled to keep their voices steady as they confirmed the name. Heath Ledger, 28 years old, found dead in his apartment. The shock was immediate and visceral, not just because he was young, but because he was everywhere. His face was still fresh in trailers, magazine covers, and whispered Oscar predictions. To many, it felt impossible that someone so present could be gone so suddenly. The initial details were sparse and unsettling. There were no signs of violence, no suicide note, no immediate explanation that made sense. An Australian actor, at the height of his career, dead alone in New York, thousands of miles from home. Within hours, speculation filled the vacuum. Headlines raced ahead of facts. The phrase, drug overdose, appeared before anyone had explained what drugs, how, or why. Almost as quickly, a narrative began to harden around a single idea, that Heath Ledger had gone too far into the darkness of his most famous role, that playing the Joker had somehow broken him. It was a story the public seemed ready to accept because it felt cinematic. A tortured genius consumed by his art. A man who stared into chaos and did not come back. But this version of events, repeated again and again, began to obscure something far more uncomfortable. Because the truth suggested not a dramatic collapse, but a slow erosion. Not madness, but exhaustion. Not one reckless choice, but a series of small, ordinary decisions that stacked quietly until the margin for error disappeared. As the day unfolded, tributes poured in from every corner of the industry. Directors spoke of his focus. Co-stars described his kindness and intensity. Fans gathered online and in the streets, trying to process how someone who seemed so alive on screen could be so profoundly alone at the end. In Australia, his family woke to a nightmare playing out on international television, forced to grieve while the world debated theories about his death. What made the shock linger was the contrast. Heath Ledger had just completed what many insiders already believed was the performance of his life. The Dark Knight was months away from release, and anticipation was enormous. He was not a faded star or a forgotten talent. He was ascending, and yet, behind the scenes, the life he was living had become fragmented. Temporary apartments, long stretches away from his daughter, a body pushed beyond its limits by insomnia, anxiety, and relentless pressure. The more people tried to explain his death in grand, dramatic terms, the more another question began to surface quietly beneath the noise. How does someone surrounded by success slip into a state where no one is there at the end? And how many warning signs can exist in plain sight before tragedy stops feeling sudden at all? Heath Ledger's story did not begin in Hollywood. and it certainly did not begin in that Manhattan apartment. To understand how his final hours came to pass, it is necessary to rewind far beyond the headlines, back to a childhood shaped by distance, discipline, and an early hunger to escape ordinary paths. He was born in Perth, Western Australia, far from the centers of the film world that would later define him. His parents separated when he was young, a fracture that quietly reshaped his sense of stability. Acting arrived not as a childhood fantasy, but as a refuge, a place where focus replaced uncertainty. As a teenager, Heath was restless and driven. He left school early, chasing auditions across Australia with a confidence that bordered on stubbornness. Early television roles brought modest recognition, but also a clear message. If he wanted more, he would have to leave home. When he arrived in Hollywood in the late 1990s, he was quickly categorized: handsome, charismatic, a potential teen idol. Films like 10 Things I Hate About You gave him visibility, but also boxed him into an image he quietly resented. Even then, he was already fighting the gap between how the world saw him and how he saw himself. Rather than lean into easy success, Heath did something risky. He began turning down roles that promised money and fame, but offered little challenge. He chose smaller films, darker characters, and directors who pushed him into uncomfortable emotional spaces. Movies like Monsters Ball and The Patriot hinted at his range, but it was Brokeback Mountain that marked a turning point. The role demanded vulnerability, restraint, and emotional precision, and Heath delivered a performance that stunned audiences and critics alike. The acclaim was immense, but so was the scrutiny. Praise came hand in hand with controversy, judgment, and a level of public attention he had never experienced before. Success accelerated his life in ways that were difficult to control. He became a father, a role he embraced deeply, but one that complicated an already demanding career. Relationships strained under the weight of travel, expectation, and time apart. By the mid-2000s, Heath's life had become a cycle of intense work followed by abrupt isolation. Film sets were all-consuming. Downtime felt empty. Sleep became elusive. Friends would later recall that he struggled to switch off, that his mind rarely slowed down enough to rest. Insomnia was not a passing inconvenience. It became a defining condition. Heath spoke openly in interviews about sleeping only a few hours a night, about lying awake with thoughts racing uncontrollably. Doctors prescribed medication to help him rest, then additional medication to counter side effects. None of it came with a clear, long-term plan. Like many high-functioning professionals under pressure, he kept moving forward, assuming he could manage it all. Then came the dark night. The role of the Joker demanded immersion, both physically and psychologically. Heath isolated himself during preparation, keeping journals filled with fragmented thoughts and dark imagery. Later, these details would be exaggerated and mythologized, but the reality was more complex. He was not unraveling. He was working. Intensely. Obsessively. At the same time, his sleep worsened. Anxiety crept in alongside exhaustion. The boundaries between recovery and coping blurred. By the time filming ended, Heath was drained. He had delivered something extraordinary, but the cost was becoming visible to those closest to him. Weight loss, fatigue, a reliance on medication to manage symptoms rather than address causes. He moved between temporary homes, never fully settling, carrying his life in transit. The sense of momentum that had fueled his rise now worked against him. There was no pause, no reset, no moment where someone forced the question of how close he was to the edge. Looking back, it becomes clear that his death was not the result of a single role or a single night. It was the endpoint of years spent pushing through warning signs, trusting that talent and determination could override physical limits. The tragedy lies not in dramatic collapse, but in the quiet normalization of strain. A life that appeared brilliant from the outside was, step by step, becoming unsustainable. As the months turned into weeks before his death, the signs grew harder to dismiss. Heath Ledger was no longer just tired, he was depleted. Friends and collaborators noticed that the energy which once fueled his performances now came in shorter bursts, followed by long stretches of withdrawal. He was still working, still planning future projects, still talking about directing and about spending more time with his daughter. On the surface, life appeared to be moving forward, but underneath, the machinery that kept him balanced was failing. After completing The Dark Knight, Heath remained in New York, dividing his time between post-production work, script development, and meetings. He was also dealing with lingering health issues that had accumulated quietly over years. Chronic insomnia had become central to his daily routine. Reports later revealed that he was prescribed multiple medications intended to address sleep, anxiety, pain, and respiratory issues. None of them, on their own, were unusual. Together, they formed a fragile chemical equation that required careful oversight. That oversight never truly existed. People close to Heath would later describe how difficult it was to reach him consistently during this period. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were delayed. He canceled plans abruptly. Not out of arrogance or disinterest, but because his body simply could not keep up. The city around him never slowed down. New York, in winter, is relentless. Cold streets, constant noise, long nights. For someone already struggling to rest, it amplified the sense of isolation. In the final weeks, Heath moved into a rented apartment in Soho. It was meant to be temporary, a quiet base while he organized his next steps. Inside, the space was sparse and functional. A place to sleep, a place to recover, yet sleep remained elusive. According to those who spoke with him, he continued to experiment with medication dosages, trying to find relief without fully understanding the risks. This was not recklessness in the way tabloids would later suggest. It was desperation, the kind that comes when exhaustion clouds judgment and relief feels urgent. On the evening before his death, Heath communicated with several people. There were conversations about work, casual exchanges, nothing that suggested finality. No goodbye messages. No explicit warning that something was about to go terribly wrong. This absence of drama would later confuse investigators and fuel speculation. How could someone planning for the future be gone just hours later? But that is often how accidental deaths unfold. Quietly, without announcement. As night settled over Manhattan, Heath prepared to rest. The irony is cruel. Everything in that apartment was arranged for sleep. The medications, the locked door, the silence. At some point, he lay down, expecting relief. What happened next unfolded without witnesses. No one heard distress. No one intervened. The combination of substances in his system slowed his breathing until his body could no longer compensate. When morning came, the city resumed its rhythm. Unaware that inside one apartment, time had already stopped. The person who arrived to clean the space knocked repeatedly before entering. What she found would become one of the most photographed doorways in entertainment history, even though the true story lay not in that image, but in the invisible hours leading up to it. The discovery set off a chain of events that moved with grim efficiency. Emergency services were called. Paramedics confirmed what had already become clear. Heath Ledger was pronounced dead at the scene. Word traveled from the apartment to the police, then to the press, then across the world in a matter of hours. But in those first moments, inside that quiet Soho space, there was only confusion and disbelief. No sign of struggle. No clear explanation. Just a young man gone too soon. As investigators began their work, attention immediately turned to what was inside the apartment. Prescription bottles were collected. Labels were read carefully. Names of medications that, on their own, were widely used and legally prescribed. Painkillers, anti-anxiety drugs, sleeping aids. The list did not point to illegal substances or obvious abuse. Instead, it revealed a pattern that was far more unsettling. Multiple prescriptions from different doctors, none of whom had a complete picture of what the others had prescribed. A system built on specialization, not coordination. The medical examiner's office would later conclude that Heath Ledger's death was accidental, caused by acute intoxication due to the combined effects of several prescription drugs. The word accidental landed heavily in the public consciousness. It suggested randomness, bad luck, an unforeseeable mistake. Yet, for many, it did not bring closure. Because accidents still have causes. They still follow chains of decisions. And in this case, those chains raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility. Why was someone known to be struggling with severe insomnia given multiple central nervous system depressants without stricter monitoring? Why was there no single physician managing his care holistically? And why did the entertainment industry, which depended so heavily on his performance, fail to slow down long enough to protect him when the warning signs were already visible? As these questions circulated, the myth of the Joker continued to grow. Some outlets leaned into the narrative that the role had consumed him, that his immersion in darkness had led directly to his death. It was a compelling story, but it distracted from the more mundane truth. Heath Ledger did not die because he played a villain. He died because he was exhausted, overwhelmed, and relying on a patchwork solution to manage a body that was shutting down. The focus on his final performance also had a strange effect. When The Dark Knight was eventually released, audiences watched the Joker with a new lens. Every gesture felt prophetic. Every line seemed like a farewell. The performance was celebrated as legendary, but it was inseparable from the knowledge that the man behind it would never see the reaction, never hear the applause. His absence haunted the film, turning entertainment into elegy. Behind the scenes, the people closest to Heath were left to navigate grief amid relentless public attention. His family had to defend his memory against sensationalism. Friends spoke cautiously, trying to honor his complexity without feeding speculation. The truth sat uncomfortably between extremes. He was neither a reckless addict nor a victim of his own talent. He was a human being caught in a system that mistook endurance for resilience. Even after official conclusions were released, debate did not end. Some questioned the prescribing practices. Others focused on the broader culture of overmedication and burnout. The case became a reference point in discussions about mental health, celebrity isolation, and the hidden dangers of legal substances. In death, Heath Ledger became part of a larger conversation that extended far beyond Hollywood. And yet, for all the analysis and argument, one image remains the most haunting. A quiet apartment, a locked door, a man who intended to sleep and never woke up. The final hours did not contain drama or spectacle. They contained something far more unsettling: silence. In the days that followed, the world tried to make sense of what had been lost. Vigils appeared outside cinemas and theaters. Fans left handwritten notes, flowers, and photographs, as if proximity to his image might somehow bridge the distance created by his absence. Colleagues spoke not only about his talent, but about his curiosity. His generosity on set, the way he disappeared into characters yet remained deeply human off-camera. The grief was not abstract, it felt personal, even to people who had never met him, because Heath Ledger had been in their living rooms, their movie nights, their cultural memory. When The Dark Knight premiered later that year, it became more than a film. It was an encounter with a ghost. Audiences watched, knowing they were seeing the final work of a man who had already crossed a line he never intended to approach. The Joker's chaos, his laughter, his unsettling calm, all carried an unintended weight. The performance earned Heath a posthumous Academy Award, one of the few ever given. His family accepted it on his behalf, their composure masking a loss that no recognition could soften. Applause filled the room, but it was followed by a silence that lingered long after the ceremony ended. Yet Heath Ledger's legacy is not confined to that role, or to the circumstances of his death. It lives in the way his story changed conversations. His passing forced a reckoning with how easily exhaustion can be hidden behind success, how insomnia and anxiety are often minimized until they become dangerous, and how systems designed to help can fail when they operate in fragments. His death exposed the thin line between coping and collapse, especially for those whose lives are lived under constant observation. There is something deeply sobering about the ordinariness of his final hours. No dramatic confrontation. No final speech. Just a man trying to rest. In that ordinariness lies the lesson that makes his story endure. Tragedy does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as routine, normalized by familiarity, overlooked because nothing appears urgent until it is too late. Looking back from the end of his life, Heath Ledger's journey feels like a study in contrasts. Immense talent paired with private vulnerability. Global fame set against profound solitude. A performance that would be remembered for generations, followed by a death that raised questions still being asked today. His final hours remind us that brilliance does not grant immunity, and that the cost of relentless pressure is often paid in ways that cannot be seen from the outside. In the end, Heath Ledger did not vanish into myth. He left behind work that continues to move people, and a cautionary truth that resonates far beyond Hollywood. The hours before his death were not filled with spectacle, but they echo loudly because they reveal how fragile even the brightest lives can be. And perhaps that is the quiet power of remembering his final moments. Not to romanticize them, but to recognize, in their stillness, the human need for care, connection, and rest. In the years since, Heath Ledger's final hours have been revisited again and again. Not because they offer spectacle, but because they offer warning. His story sits at the intersection of talent, pressure, medicine, and silence. It reminds us that danger does not always come in the form of excess or chaos. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in normalcy, signed off by professionals, and justified by the belief that tomorrow will be easier. What remains most unsettling is how close help might have been, and how invisible the risk appeared until it was irreversible. A different conversation, a coordinated medical plan, a pause that lasted long enough to restore balance. These are not dramatic interventions, yet their absence shaped the outcome. In that sense, Heath Ledger's final hours continue to speak, quietly but insistently, to anyone living at the edge of exhaustion. Remembering him this way is not about reopening wounds. It is about honoring a life by acknowledging the truth of its ending, not as a myth, not as a cautionary headline, but as a human story that asks us to look more carefully at the people who seem strongest, brightest, and most capable of carrying the weight alone. Years from now, new audiences will still discover Heath Ledger through his performances. They will see the intensity, the fearlessness, the commitment that made him unforgettable. What they will not see, unless they look closer, is the cost of carrying that intensity. Without rest, without coordination, without a safety net strong enough to catch him when his body finally gave in. His final hours were not extraordinary because of what happened in them, but because of what did not. No alarm, no intervention, no one realizing that the line had already been crossed. In that quiet absence lies the reason his story endures. It asks a question that remains painfully relevant. How many people reach the end, not because they chose to disappear, but because the systems around them failed to slow down? And when the screen fades to black, what lingers is not the legend of a role, or the shock of a headline, but the image of a man who simply wanted to sleep. In the aftermath of Heath Ledger's death, changes came quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way they often do after tragedy. There was no sweeping reform announced in his name, no single rule that could guarantee safety. But among doctors, agents, producers, and performers, his story became a reference point, a reminder that insomnia is not trivial, that anxiety is not a weakness, that prescription medication, when fragmented across multiple sources, can be just as lethal as anything illicit. Within the industry, conversations shifted. Actors began speaking more openly about exhaustion and mental strain. Some productions adjusted schedules. Some doctors became more cautious about overlapping prescriptions. These were small steps, imperfect and uneven. But they were steps nonetheless. Heath Ledger's final hours had exposed a vulnerability that many recognized in themselves, even if they had never admitted it out loud. For his family, the legacy was more intimate and more enduring. They guarded his memory carefully, resisting narratives that reduced his life to a single role or his death to a convenient myth. They spoke instead about his curiosity, his humor, his devotion as a father. Heath Ledger was not defined by how he died, but neither could his death be separated from how he lived in his final years. Time has a way of softening shock but sharpening meaning. As years passed, the image of Heath Ledger, lying alone in that Manhattan apartment, became less about tragedy and more about warning. A warning against glorifying burnout, against mistaking productivity for health, against assuming that strength means silence. His final hours remind us that care is not a luxury reserved for moments of collapse, but a necessity woven into everyday survival. In remembering those hours, there is an invitation to look differently at the people we admire, to listen more closely when someone says they cannot sleep, to ask follow-up questions when solutions arrive too easily, to recognize that the absence of drama does not mean the absence of danger. Heath Ledger's story endures not because it is mysterious, but because it is painfully clear. And perhaps that is where his final moments leave us. Not with answers that settle the mind, but with awareness that unsettles complacency. The awareness that brilliance can coexist with fragility, that success can mask decline, and that sometimes the most important thing we can offer one another is not applause, but attention.